in 314 for a shooting at Century Theaters. They're saying somebody's shooting in the auditorium.
Roger, keep your fires west of the smoke. You're cleared hot. An officer hit. Send me the world.
Don't go over that fence. Don't go over that fence. Grab the shotgun again.
Welcome to Tactical Tangents.
Welcome back to Tactical Tangents. This is Mike. This episode is brought to you by Drip Drop. Drip Drop Oral Rehydration Solution is an electrolyte powder that you mix with water. It was formulated by a doctor for quick absorption. I work in the desert, and it only takes a few hours in the heat, wearing body armor, carrying around a bunch of gear before I start feeling like crap and fall behind the curve in dehydration. Drip Drop keeps you in the fight so you can finish the mission and rehab for the next one. Go get you some at dripdrop.com or on Amazon, or ask your supply guy to find it for you.
And this is Jim. This episode is also brought to you by Dry Fire Mag. Ammo is getting hard to find these days, and you need to stay proficient by working your dry fire training. Dry Fire Mag solves the common and annoying problem in dry fire training of constantly having to rack the slide to reset the trigger. With this thing, all you do is clear your weapon, load the training magazine, and get to work. Check them out at dryfiremag.com. It is time to talk about driving. And this is going to be kind of funny because anyone who knows me well knows it's a little ironic to hear driving advice from me.
Yeah, same here. I'm pretty. my passengers will usually tell you the last person they want to drive with is me.
Yeah, I have crashed more cars than most of our listeners have ever owned. I have also driven in more countries and more war zones than most of our listeners will ever visit, probably. And I have learned a lot along the way, right? So let's talk about driving. And we're going to talk kind of generically, all kinds of driving. Tactical driving, driving overseas, driving over land, driving the golf cart, whatever you need to do, whatever your country demands of you.
Competency for the Air Force guys listening.
That's right. That's right. You know, whatever my service needs me to be, right? We're going to do that. And you know, there are some specifics. There are certain ways that you drive a car when you're four-wheeling in the desert, right? Versus super wet terrain, or how you drive in a city with a real small car, or how you drive a police car, right? There's some specifics, and some of those we're going to be able to get to, some we won't. But there are common themes across all of those, and those are the ones I want to talk about in this episode. For me, everything we talk about comes down to operational risk management, right? That process through which we figure out what could go wrong, figure out how likely it is to go wrong, how bad it is if it goes wrong, and then figure out what we can do about it to either make it less likely or less hazardous, and make decisions and learn from our mistakes, right? It all comes back down to ORM. And this is actually a huge area where tacticians, people in the tactical world, the military, law enforcement, even, and maybe especially in the civilian world, they way underestimate the hazards of driving and way overestimate the likelihood they're going to get in a firefight, right? Yep. Like some Boondock Saints action, right? So think about that. Think through the people you know who are dead. People who have died of anything other than natural causes in your lifetime. And odds are very good. You can probably think of one or two people who've killed themselves. You can probably think of one or two people who have died due to, maybe some sort of interpersonal violence. And you probably know several people who have been killed or very seriously injured in a car wreck, right? So that's important. It's important to understand kind of where collisions fall in your overall risk picture. So what are the hazards? What are the things that could go wrong? And we talked about this a little bit in the ORM episode, but we're not just talking about like the event, but the damage and harm that comes from the event, right? So injury or death caused by collision. Injury or death from interpersonal violence on the road. And maybe that's road rage. Maybe that's an ambush with ISIS or the Russians against the Ukrainians, whatever. But, interpersonal violence happens against mobile and moving targets.
Even the classic, like the cop at the red light, that gets ambushed in his car. It doesn't happen very often. In our fantasy, it happens all the time, but in reality, it doesn't happen often. But it has happened. We've talked about some examples of where that sort of thing has happened.
Yep.
Another one that I think about is like getting stuck somewhere. And there's a whole lot of hazards that come with that. Your car breaks down, and it's not the driving or the crashing really that you're worried about. It's potentially the environment that you're stuck in, like you're stuck in a snowstorm somewhere, or out in the middle of the desert without any water or food. There was one time I was traveling overseas, and my wife and I got stuck in the middle of Italy somewhere, and in a small town where no one really spoke any English, and it was later in the day, and we had to get the rental car that we had towed. They took us to some, I'm just going to go ahead and say it, some like little shithole mechanic shop to try to get it fixed, and they're like, we can't fix it. So they were going to send us a taxi to go to the nearest airport, which was like 20 minutes away, to try to get another rental car. The problem is that place closed in like 15, 20 minutes. So like we were gonna have to wait for a cab and then drive 20 minutes. Like that just wasn't going to work out. So we were going to be stuck there. We were going to be stuck in this town with not a lot of English and nowhere really to go. And so one of these dudes at this sketchy little mechanic shop offered us a ride. And his name was Ramone, and he was actually a very nice guy. But he was in his like 84. Oh yeah,
Ramone, the pig farmer. I know Ramone.
He was. So interestingly, we learned because obviously there was some rapport building that occurred here. We learned that he was actually went to school to be a pharmacist in the UK, and that was not as lucrative for him as going back to his family's pig farm. And so he was a pig farmer, and so he's got his like 1986 Datsun, like little hatchback that that's full of a bunch of crap. And he offers my wife and I a ride to the airport. And we're like, well, we either accept the ride or we're stuck. So we're going to go for it. We cram our luggage into this thing, and he's driving us. And I'm looking around the car for things I can stab this guy with, or whatever if I have to. And we come to, as we get into like the city center of this little town near the airport, there is a sign, and it says like the airport is that way and the city is this way. And he goes the direction away from the airport. And I'm like, okay. Here's the thing. So then he goes, no, it's a shortcut. It's a shortcut. And this guy actually spoke English. Like I said, he went to school in the UK. It's a shortcut. I'm like, is it though? So sure enough, he gets us to the airport, and it was fine. But like, talk about an element of risk there. I mean, we were definitely doing some risk management in that scenario. And, that's what happens if you get stuck somewhere you don't want to get stuck. So I think that's a pretty serious risk to consider. And another one that I can think of is we had Ryan Wyatt. He's our paramedic friend that has done just about every form of paramedicine you can think of. And he talks about when his helicopter crashed, he was on a Little Bird doing medevac stuff in Iraq, and his Little Bird went down. And wasn't the helicopter crash he had to worry about. It's now I'm out in Iraq, in bad guy land, trying to figure out what to do next. So think about that kind of stuff as it relates to travel as well. It's not just the crashes and the obvious stuff.
Yeah, getting stuck. I got stuck once in the worst part of Las Vegas, and couldn't get a taxi, and started walking across the worst part of Vegas. And it was fine, but it was also one of the sketchier events I've had, including, things overseas. So those were the things like what can go wrong. And I'm sure there are plenty of others, but those are just a couple to kind of jog our interest, right? So how likely are those things versus how severe are those things? Well, I want to emphasize collision, as far as likelihood, is way worse than interpersonal violence.
Way more likely, right?
Way more likely. And we need to be honest with ourselves about that. Your odds of getting T-boned at an intersection are like 69,000% higher than your odds of getting carjacked. Plan accordingly. And by the way, that's true even in places like Baghdad.
And that might be especially true in a place like Baghdad. I've never driven there, but this is actually something that I've talked to a few people recently about. I was... another trip that I went on, we were in Myanmar, And I don't even think we can't even travel there anymore because that place kind of fell apart. It was only together for a little bit, but I visited there, and I was with a friend who had his own car and was able to do his own driving, and that shit was sketchy. Like, the driving in that place. I mean, they just started getting cars not too long ago, and there was no consistency even of like the cars that had controls on the right or the left, because it was just a hodgepodge. Third world country, they just got cars wherever they can get them. Yeah. And so watching people drive around there, and not just there, lots of places, Thailand, various places in Europe, it is very different than here in the U.S. And my cousin just recently was in the Philippines, and he was posted on Facebook like, I don't know how we survived the drive here. The driving is just so crazy. He's making some comments about it. And then he posts how he got on one of those. I don't know if he listens to the show, but if you do, buddy, I'm just going to give you shit for this. He was talking about how he took one of the rides on those little bikes, the little scooter bikes, the tuk-tuk bikes. And he was like, well, it's cheaper than a taxi. I'm like, not if you count your life insurance premium. Because so like these places in the world are very, very different to drive in. And so if you're overseas doing something, consider that it might not be what you're used to. There's a whole different like subculture to the driving. And one thing to consider there is a lot of people complain about like traffic enforcement in the US. And to be completely honest with you, I am not a big traffic guy. I don't go around writing tickets and stuff like that. But I would just offer that it's a lot easier and probably safer to drive here in a lot of ways. And I don't know if there's any data to support like a correlation to traffic enforcement or like just rule of law. Because you go to Mexico, for example, and people drive drunk all the time. It's just accepted. It's just kind of a cultural difference that we have. Here, it's not tolerated the same way. And so it's just different. And you have to just consider that.
Yeah. So, funny thing about the third world country thing is people often in those countries will tell you they have way fewer accidents than we do, which is, I don't know, I haven't seen the stats on that. Probably varies country to country. Parts of that are probably true. Like in West Africa, I've seen like 8-lane intersections with no stoplight, no traffic direction, and like 85 million cars and pedestrians and goats and motos and rickshaws. And under the circumstances, it's actually amazing how rarely they swap paint. Part of it is they're kind of going slow. They got nowhere to go and they got all day to get there.
That's a big cultural thing, actually, is like the sense of time.
Kind of the island life kind of
exactly.
approach.
Just, yeah.
And they have a system. They have a system that's based on their idea of courtesy and cues and gestures and willingness to die in order to merge. And if you don't know the system, you're going to have a hard time. Right. So in some cases, especially if you're overseas, maybe it's useful to have a driver, like a trusted local driver. Personally, I've had several instances in the United States that were at least as scary driving as I've had overseas. I'll take the Jordanians over the Nashvillians any day, actually. So, what causes crashes? Like when a car smashes into another car, that's a crash. Yeah, got it. Bad drivers, obviously, got it. Everyone who's not me is a bad driver, obviously. Everyone around here is a bad driver, right? Cool. Well, it turns out there are actually specific things that cause crashes, right? Physics is a big one. Physics versus car and driver performance. Think of that as kind of an equation. Physics, car and driver, and how the car and the driver are doing, right? So a couple just basic physics concepts. Force is equal to mass times acceleration. F equals ma. I learned that in my fancy physics class in college. And there's P equals mv, which is momentum equals mass times velocity. Now, that's cool, and you can do equations about that, but what it means in practical terms is your ability to stop and your ability to turn is a function of traction, the grip that your tires have against the ground, right? Speed, velocity, and changes in speed or direction does specific things to you, right? There are times to go fast and there are times to go slow. And you've probably seen lots of cool action movies where everyone's going like 120 miles an hour and stuff. And that's cool. And there are times you need to go fast, right? To get out of a situation or into a situation. But you have to understand what speed costs you, what velocity costs you, and rapid changes in velocity cost you. Acceleration, right? Often, more deliberate turns with less velocity will get you and your car out of danger quicker. So sometimes slower is faster. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast, all that jazz.
It also takes less distance.
Yeah.
Like during the turn, that velocity, it's going to be a wider turn the faster you're going, so you can get a tighter turn with a little less speed.
Yep. So sometimes quick and fast are different. And that's important to understand in the context of driving, right? Speed, specifically, though, cuts your reaction time, which is a giant factor in car crashes. It takes more time and more distance to stop or slow your car, and it makes it harder to turn. It requires more force, more tire grip, among other things, to turn. And when you do get in that collision, it puts way more energy into that collision.
Speaking of the time to go fast and time to go slow bit, if you're driving aggressively or you're being evasive, right? You're trying to get away from something or you're trying to avoid something, like avoid hitting something. One thing to think about in terms of managing speed is when you brake and when you accelerate in relation to the turn. So on your way into the turn, if you're going to slow down before your turn, you want to do that before the turn, right? Before you start turning. So brakes, then turn into it. And then on the way out of it, once you've come out of that, the apex of the turn is when you can accelerate out of it. What you don't want to do is start imposing two different forces in two different directions on the car, because it becomes a lot more difficult to predict, right? If you turn and you're also accelerating or decelerating at the same time, it becomes a little bit more chaotic to manage in terms of like losing traction and that sort of thing. So brake and then turn, and then you can accelerate out of the turn. Now, there's something to be said about sort of feathering the throttle during a turn, and you can do that. You can manage your turn radius with your throttle a little bit. But if you are taking a very sharp corner, you don't want to do a whole lot of that, right? That's more of like your wider radius sort of turn. The other thing about the energy bit, and Jim was talking about physics and equations and stuff. Kinetic energy is 1/2 mass times velocity squared. And again, I don't care about the math. I'm not here giving you homework or telling you to work that out or anything. But that is to say that the v squared, the velocity squared, the amount of kinetic energy involved in what could be a potential collision down the road, right, is exponentially higher as velocity increases. So consider if you're in a little like Mazda Miata versus a semi-truck, how much energy goes into those two things crashing together is much more affected by speed than it is the difference in mass. The velocity is a contributing factor there in how much energy gets involved. And so that's something you have to think about. One of the biggest determining factors related to mortality, like whether or not you're going to either die or you're going to have injuries that you're going to die early, like later on from, has to do with that, that speed factor.
Yeah, how much energy is transferred into your body in the collision, right? That is essentially what trauma is the transfer of energy into your organs that aren't meant to have a whole lot of external energy added to them, right? Another thing that we know causes crashes is inattention. And yeah, it's easy to say, yeah, people should pay attention. They should put down their gosh darn phones. Rah. Yeah, that's true. They should. 100%. Okay. Inattention, though, it takes a lot of, it takes a lot of forms. And everybody is guilty of some form of it, even if you're super disciplined about your phone. That's good. I want you to be. But the biggest mistake you can make is assuming you're somehow immune from it. You're not. distraction comes in a lot of different ways. Technology, either the phone or the laptop if you're a cop, or any other situational awareness tools in the military that we might have up in front of us, an ATAC or whatever. Conversations with passengers. Like,
especially emotional ones with like a spouse or something.
Oh, wives love having deep conversations while merging on freeways. They love it. I don't know why, but they really do, right? Navigation. When you drop the car to drive your GPS, right? Fatigue. You might be paying attention as hard as you can, but if you haven't slept, or if you're at the end of a very exhausting day, you're going to have a hard time paying as much attention as you need to get the reaction time you need to. Obviously, alcohol. I count that as an inattention thing. It affects a bunch of other things too, but it is a distraction. Your ability to multitask goes down when your blood alcohol content goes up. And even just stuff like the sun in your eyes. You might be physically blocking your vision with your hand, and you might be blocking the brake lights when you do that, or the red light when you do that.
Dirty or foggy windshields. When we talk about impaired driving, like the alcohol thing, one of the things that we measure when we do field sobriety tests is driving is a divided attention task, right? You have physical tasks and mental tasks that you're doing at the same time. And so by its nature, driving is a divided attention task. And I'll tell you outright, not about impaired driving, obviously, but like being on my phone and stuff, like I'm terrible about that, right? I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I'm an angel about that, because I ain't at all. It's a tough habit to break. I get it. So I'm not going to sit here and preach that as a behavior change that you should take from this, because I would be a total hypocrite. But what I will say is that humans have a very, very strong tendency to overestimate their ability to quote unquote multitask. And there's actually research in this area. And the bottom line of that research is that like there really is no such thing as multitasking. You can only focus on one thing at a time, and you can bounce back and forth, but you're really not doing two things at once, if that makes sense. So that being said, you could make some argument perhaps that your ability to perform or drive or juggle tasks, I'll say that instead of multitasking because it's bouncing from one to the other. Maybe your 80% is better than some other people's 100%, or something, along those lines. Maybe it's acceptable, right? Looking at the navigation and also watching the road, or having a conversation, like 80% might be good enough. 60% might be good enough until it isn't, right? And that's what we have to watch out for, is just like how we know when to go fast, know when to go slow, is how much attention do I need to be paying in this scenario, right? Merging onto the freeway, for example, or driving lights and sirens somewhere, or, again, if I'm on an open lane, open road, 2-lane highway, and there's no cars in sight, that's different than if I'm coming up on construction traffic or braking cars for another incident or something like that, right? So you might be good enough at less than 100%, and that's fine. But just understand that, number one, if you're not 100% committed to whatever task, that you are accepting risk when you do that. And number two, don't fool yourself into overestimating your ability to do it, because that is a natural tendency. Is you're like, oh yeah, like if you were to estimate, how good of a driver you were while you're on your phone or eating a burrito, or, steering with your knee and typing on the computer or whatever, you're going to overestimate how good you really are compared to the others. So we should all probably do better in that area, myself included, but it is what it is.
Another one that'll get you is spacing. Just the physical distance between you and the cars around you, specifically the car in front of you, but really the cars in every direction, right? And the relationship of spacing to reaction time is a thing you've got to understand, right? Following distance will hose you. You have to understand the relationship between speed, distance, and time. Distance is time at a set speed. Okay? So the faster you go, the more space you have to leave between you and the car in front of you. And I know you know that, right? Everyone listening has had driver's ed and they fundamentally understand that. But that's weird because everyone who follows me on my way to work somehow missed that memo. That's really weird to me. So, and I'm guilty too. Sometimes somebody in front of me is going 1 mile an hour too gosh darn slow, and I need to remind them, communicate to them that they're failing as a human. I understand.
You suck at life.
They suck at life, and someone needs to help them. I get it. But understand the cost, right? If I give up distance, I'm giving up time. So, Mike, you were an EMT in your past life. You're a police officer in your present life, last I checked. And I think you have attended a lot of crashes. Like, if you had to guess how many crash scenes you have attended to one way or another, how many do you think you have?
Oh, I don't know. Thousands. I mean,
and some of those were pretty gosh darn gnarly, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure.
Like multiple fatality kind of wrecks.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons that I don't, really when it comes to like DUI enforcement, I don't have, even though I'm not a DUI guy, like I don't go out looking for them, but if I get behind one, I'll still do them because I've picked kids up off the road, Yeah. And there's a lot of things that contribute. There's so many different types, right? Like impaired driving is whatever segment you want to say of traffic collisions. Now, the most likely thing to occur in impaired driving scenarios, the most likely person to die is the impaired driver, because more often than not, it's a single vehicle collision, and it's the impaired driver, the guy in that car, that kills himself, basically. Hopefully there's no one else in the car, because that's problematic. But more often than not, that is the case, is it's single vehicle collisions and it's that person. Now, but past that, obviously, it starts to vary. Speed is a big factor, because for all the things we talked about, one, the amount of energy involved that contributes to things like the severity of the injuries is a big factor of speed. So your slower speed collisions, usually no one gets hurt, and we don't even necessarily have to go right to those. They could get out of the roadway themselves. They can treat themselves because there's no real life-threatening injuries.
I got rear-ended in a McDonald's drive-thru once in Southern California. Didn't even get out of the car. We just waved. They were cute. It was fine.
One of the big ones that I've seen a lot is like lighting. And it's a visibility thing, not just in terms of like seeing out of the car, but at night, dealing with pedestrians. That's a huge issue, is like you're looking ahead in the road, you're paying attention, your lights are shining where they're shining, but you just don't see the guy step out into the road, whether it's at a crosswalk or not. You just don't see them, right? So lighting is a big factor when it comes to pedestrian stuff. Jumping back to the speed thing, the one thing I didn't hit on, Jim talked about the reaction time, right? And in Arizona, like if you get let's say you rear-end somebody, you can be cited for speeding, and it's failing to reduce or control your speed to avoid a collision. So it speaks to that reaction time bit, all of those things that, you have less time to react. It takes you more distance to slow down. It takes you longer to slow down. Your inputs don't translate into outputs as quickly in the car. So that's a big one. Loss of control, loss of traction, I would say is fairly common. Your most
I don't know how to describe this, but there's a couple that I've seen in person lately where like the far right lane is stopped. They leave a gap so that a car can come out of a driveway, and the car goes past the stopped cars and turns into traffic, and then gets hit by a speeding car in the number middle, whatever that is, lane, number 2 lane. Yeah. And the speeding car doesn't have the reaction time to recognize what's happening, and the car pulling out into traffic
can't see them.
Their visibility is blocked by the stopped cars, right? And they're not giving the other traffic enough reaction time to stop or slow for them.
Yeah, and that's actually a great point. So then we could talk about like collisions at intersections, right? Like people running red light, trying to get every last inch of that yellow, every last inch out of that yellow light, and make the light. And most of the time, 5 or 6 cars push their way through when the light turns yellow, and maybe a couple after it turns red. But there's traffic lights nowadays usually have a delay before the next cycle will turn green to deal with that. But you just can't count on it all the time, right? I mean, it's just, you would hope that people would just follow the traffic signals, but T-bone collisions are serious. Head-on collisions are pretty serious. Not as common though. Yeah. So anyway, I've seen a bunch, but the trends it just depends. A lot of it's environmental. Like a city with not a lot of highways, you're going to see a lot more intersection stuff. 2-lane roads at night, you're going to see wrong way drivers, people falling asleep on the road. Falling asleep is a big one.
I've been there. I've done it. I crashed a car doing it. Yeah. So Mike brought up a good point about how you have to read the situation and recognize when it's time to put down the phone, recognize when it's time to focus on driving. And I like that. For me, that is a risk analysis, and your risk analysis is dynamic. You're changing it with the situation as you get more information, as you figure things out, right? So you're constantly trying to analyze what's the situation with the driver right now. And let's assume you're the driver. What's the situation with me right now? Am I rested? Am I distracted? Do I have major life events going on? Am I medicated? Am I high? Am I whatever, right? And then consider the risk of the car. Does this car have decent brakes? Does this car have these decent tires? Is this car small and dark and hard to see, or big and bright and easy to see? And the environment. What is the lighting? Does everyone have the sun in their eyes? Am I in a real dense situation? Am I in a real rural situation? And then adjust your practices and your attention and everything else accordingly, right?
Wetter, icy roads.
Yeah. So when you're thinking about like what you can do to adjust, think about some things, right? Do things that make the hazard either less likely or less severe. An example is wear your seatbelt. You know to wear your seatbelt. A shocking number of people don't wear their seatbelt. An amazing number of cops don't wear their seatbelt.
Which is absolutely absurd. Like, people talk about, I don't want to get trapped in my car. Look, if you're rolling through a parking lot and you want to unbuckle on your way to the parking lot, that's fine. I'm not worried about your parking lot speed collision. But again, going back to the real risk, you're more likely to die in a crash than you are in a shooting.
Yep.
That's as far absurd. As wear your gosh dang seatbelt.
Yeah. So as far as risk mitigation goes, does a seatbelt make the crash less likely or less severe? It doesn't affect the likelihood of the crash. It affects the severity, the survivability of the crash, right? So just as an example, that's a thing you can do to adjust your risk.
This is Mike, and I just want to jump in real quick to announce our new partnership with Brink Drones. Brink has created life-saving capabilities in a drone that can break windows, fly into houses and confined spaces, and even crash into things and stay in the air with advanced pilot assistance that does not use GPS. Brink drones are built in the USA. It has night vision and IR that can function in blacked out and zero light conditions. It can flip itself back over, and it is a flying cell phone with two-way communication and a live video feed. It can even carry and drop off items for hostage negotiators with the payload feature. Brink has a really cool and compelling heritage that came to be after the 1 October mass shooting at Mandalay Bay in Las Vegas, and they are committed in their mission to leverage technology to save lives. And I can tell you firsthand that their drones will do just that by flying into places that are too dangerous to risk human lives. If you work in public safety, your agency needs to see what this drone can do. Go check out Brink Drones at brinkdrones.com, or feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to tell you all about them. Again, that's Brink, BRINC, drones.com.
Driving's a learned skill. I wish I could teach you all the cool driving techniques and tactics in a podcast, but it doesn't work that way. It's very hands-on, right? But I think that there are some hands-on things that you can start to think about over the course of this episode. Maybe if you're listening while driving, and of course paying attention to the road, think about what you're doing with your hands. There are specific things to do with your hands to drive well, right? Think about what you're doing with your eyeballs. Where are your eyes? How are you scanning? And you don't have to scan like a robot, but you do have to keep your eyes moving, right? Your hands should be more or less at 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock on the sides of the steering wheel. And there's lots of good reasons for that. Fatigue and controllability and how airbags deploy. There are lots of good reasons to have your hands at 9 and 3. Unless you have a good reason not to. No matter what your mom taught you, do 9 and 3.
So not your knee, Jim, is what you're saying? Don't steer with my knee.
And not with your knee and not with anything else. And when you turn the wheel, there's a best way to turn the wheel, and it's counterintuitive. I've actually seen people get taught shuffle steering, and they physically can't do it. It's so against their automaticity with how they drive that they can't do it. But try to, instead of turning the wheel hand over hand, try to push the wheel with one hand and pull the wheel with the other hand. It's called shuffle steering. You can watch videos about it on YouTube. What you're going to find is you can control the car a little bit more precisely and a little bit more efficiently, and your arm won't be in the way of the airbag if and when the airbag deploys. Another thing with your eyeballs is it's human nature to stare at the thing that scares you, but that's not what's going to save you as you're driving. You have to look away from the thing that scares you toward where you want the car to go. So look for the out, not for the obstacle. And that's a learned behavior. You got to learn it doing hands-on driving training.
There's another thing about the 9 and 3 position and shuffle steering that Jim is talking about, which is especially at the point that you are making some kind of abrupt evasive maneuver, you want to have your arms sort of fixed, like lock arm steering. And if you think about the entire steering system, right? The car interfaces with the road at the tires, and then there's a bunch of hardware that is attached to ultimately the steering wheel and then to you. So if you are loose on the steering wheel and the car is starting to do something you don't want it to, and you overcorrect, you're going to start that looseness you're going to lose traction, right? Whereas if you keep your arms locked in position, you're removing one less wiggle point, if that makes sense. I don't know how else to describe that. That's probably a more technical way to describe that, but lock arm steering is a big deal if you have to make those abrupt evasive maneuvers. Eliminate that. You take out the slack, if that makes sense.
And just consider there's a human machine interface here, right? And you need to think about your half of that. So think about what you're doing with your eyes and with your hands, right? Another thing you can do is work on the machine, maintain the car. And we're not just talking about get the oil changed and stuff like that. Yeah, do that because it's going to make the car more reliable and you're going to have less breakdowns. But also take a real good look at your tires. We'll talk about this throughout the episode, but the tires are a big deal. The tires are the car's connection to the road. They're your ability to speed up, slow down, stop, turn. All of that comes from the tires. Your lights, your brakes, and your seatbelt. If your seatbelt isn't working right, if it's locking when it shouldn't or not locking when it shouldn't, that's one of those like life support items that you just has to be right? And it's one of the things you probably don't think about. Think about it.
Your lights, your headlights, if you got these, if you have an older car and it's got these, incandescent bulbs, and you have to be careful with this because some people will put these HID headlights in their cars that are probably not legal. There's probably some, if they're not like DOT approved or whatever. Just because you buy them at AutoZone or something doesn't mean that they're technically supposed to be on the road. However, there is something to be said about putting better lights on your car, or like cleaning the lenses if they need to be cleaned, if they turned all yellow and that you lose visibility. Try to correct that. And as long as you could do basically whatever you want with your lights, as long as you're not blinding other drivers, enhance your ability to see. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. And particularly your peripheral ability to see. Yeah. Where I live, we have 85 billion deer, and they're at least as dangerous as the other drivers. Another systems part is your windows. You have to keep your windows and mirrors clean. That's a bigger deal than most people realize. If you want to learn like a no shit spy trick, use Rain-X on your back window. That is no joke. Like traditional tradecraft is keeping your rear window as clean as you possibly can and as water resistant as you possibly can.
You're gonna have to beep all that out now.
Yeah. So we'll explain in detail later why that's a thing, but think about over the course of this episode, why do you think that is? Okay. Next is do a route study before you get in your car. That sounds nerdy, but if you're going to do some weird driving in some weird place, if your risk justifies it, stop and look at the map. Okay? The whole point of that is you're trying to reduce your task saturation that comes from navigating.
This is, I was talking to one of my therapists at one point about
his team of quarter-pointed therapists.
Yeah, about EMDR therapy. And if you're not familiar, go look it up. But one of the analogies that she talks about in terms of explaining EMDR and why it's effective has a lot to do with your brain being able to only handle so much information at a time. And so if you've ever noticed, and this was actually the specific analogy she gave me was, if you've ever noticed that you turn the stereo down when you, like, if you get off the freeway in like an area that you're unfamiliar with, and now you're trying to navigate and figure out where you're going, and you turn the radio down as if you drive better with the stereo down. It's your brain trying to reduce stimulus to focus on whatever task. So it's a subconscious mechanism, and it's where we are trying to limit or filter how much stimulus is coming in. And so if you're constantly having to look at a map or read street signs, that can really be distracting. So in terms of a route study, if you want to use that kind of thing, one of my favorite tricks is to figure out, like, what's my heads up. So if I know I have to turn on Main Street, like, I'm telling myself, based on if I'm on a major street and how fast I'm probably going, like, it's going to be the first left after 6th Avenue or whatever. Or I might say it's going to be the third left after 6th Avenue, depending on, again, the terrain and how fast I'm going, how busy it is, stuff like that. And now I don't have to, like, speed up and slow down every time I want to read a street sign, because I can blow past 6th Avenue as long as I see it on the way by. I know, or Main Street, whatever. I know, like, okay, I have 3 more streets I have to make a left. So giving yourself some kind of heads up is a good way to do that. It not only does it make you a little bit faster because you don't have to slow down to, like, read the signs before you get there, but also it eliminates one more thing you have to look for.
I like that. Wear your dang seatbelt. I think we hit that one. This one time I was in Mosul, and the Surgeon General of the Army had put signs up, like, at the hand wash station going to the dining hall, and it had pictures of MRAPs rolled over, and it said something like, "We are losing more soldiers right now to rollovers than we are to IEDs. If you get in a rollover and you're not wearing your seatbelt, I will personally fly out from DC and kick your ass," or something like that. It was very serious about, like, what was hurting people.
Yeah. And just slow down is, like, the one I would add to this list. There, I drive fast at work when I'm going to things, and I've spent my entire adult life driving lights and sirens places. It doesn't make me a good driver, just to be clear. But I've driven in emergency conditions a lot. And if there's one thing that I've learned, like 5, 10, 15 miles an hour difference, it contributes to your risk quite a bit. If nothing else, just of getting a ticket, right? Just getting pulled over and getting a ticket, your risk is a lot higher. But also, you really don't get there that much faster. Like, if you actually work out the math and you looked at the formula for this, distance equals rate times time, and you calculated, like, based on how far you're going, what your average speed would be.
A train going west at 60 miles an hour and a train going east.
Yeah. But, like, if I was to drive to LA, for example, from Tucson, it's like 500 miles or something like that, and I was going 80 miles an hour versus 95 miles an hour, I'm not saving all that much time, like maybe an hour. And then if I'm talking about being in town, going from, like, the grocery store to somewhere in town, what are you saving? Like 3-4 minutes by driving like an idiot?
But are you beating your GPS estimate? Because
you might be. Although Google has gotten pretty good, because it's
that's right.
There's
a test of your manhood, though.
They know how fast everyone else goes. But
yep.
Yeah, so maybe you're trying to beat your GPS or whatever, but you don't save that much time. It's a marginal gain, and all you're doing is increasing the risk. So just be mature about it and slow down a little bit. Like, yeah, you might not get caught. Yeah, you might be able to talk your way out of a ticket. Yeah, maybe there's no one else on the road and you're not going to get in a crash or they're not going to do anything stupid. You never know. But if you have a blowout at 100 miles an hour, like that's a problem that you don't have much warning about, right? And now you have a control issue that you're going so much faster for.
That brings up actually a good point. I lived in Arizona back in the day, and Mike taught me a thing about Arizona law specifically about the threshold at which
you
the staties will haul you off to jail. And it's a remarkably low speed relative to how many people drive.
85 or 20 over in Arizona.
85 or 20 over. So if you're going 66 and a 45,
yeah, it's technically a misdemeanor. Yeah, you could
straight to jail.
You could be arrested. Well,
straight to jail.
You could get a ticket with a court date, but it is a misdemeanor offense. It's a criminal offense, and you could be booked into jail. Yes,
straight to jail. Okay, got it. Okay, and consider like overseas. You know, we talked about the cultural stuff, and it's tough navigating. You don't speak the language, that kind of thing. Think about how having a driver, someone else, can help or hurt you. When I'm in a weird place, I like having a trusted local driver who can take a lot of that load off of me. But note that I said a trusted local driver, someone who has been vetted by, my force protection folks, someone who's been vetted by the embassy. I've got people for that, right? And I've also had, even in the States, drivers who were downright scary, like legit scary. I had one guy, he was supposed to take me to the airport, and he took me out into like a field behind the airport, and I was like, this might get weird.
Is it a shortcut though?
Yeah. And that might be another good episode of what do you do when you're not the one driving and the driver is causing trouble. An awful lot of people I know refuse to get into an Uber because they heard one story one time about how bad Ubers are. Personally, I feel much safer in an Uber than a taxi most days. Little side note. Another thing to consider is blind spots. Okay, some people will tell you that if you've got your mirrors positioned correctly, you don't have any blind spots. That's not true. I know for a fact that's not true, right? You have parts of your car's structure blocking your vision, even forward of your shoulders. Even if we're not talking about your mirror blind spot, the traditional blind spot on a car right back behind your shoulders. I'm talking about the pillars that connect the roof of your car to the front of your car. Block your view. The front of your car blocks your view right in front of your car, right? You can't see under your front bumper, but you have to be able to visualize where your front bumper is in order to maneuver in tight spaces. This is a big deal. This is a big part of being able to get yourself out of a sticky situation, is knowing exactly how far forward you've got before you hit the other car.
Yeah, we've talked about situational awareness and how I kind of like don't love that term, right? But the spatial awareness thing that Jim brings up is a much bigger deal. And one of the things that just being aware of your surroundings, right? The situational awareness component is you have a blind spot, right? And you go past a car in a lane and you just passed him at a rate sufficient to be clear of him to move over, right? That assumes that you were paying attention 3, 4, 5 seconds, however long ahead of time to know that there's no other traffic right there that you have to worry about, right? So if you're looking far enough ahead and you have a good accounting for like where other cars in the road are, that helps. Like you can give yourself some grace in terms of the blind spots. Like, yeah, I didn't look over there, but I know that guy is way behind me, right? Or he's way up in front of me, so it's not a factor, whatever.
Yeah, and you also have to visualize where you are in relation to the other car's blind spot. There is a certain segment of drivers who just gets comfortable parked right behind or right next to and behind the cars around them. And a lot of it is distracted driving. They're looking at their phone and they're kind of pacing against another car. But they're actually making themselves very, very hard to see. And that should stand out to you.
I want to hit one thing on something we've talked about in terms of like high performing teams is implicit communication. And the example that I've used a lot of times for implicit communication is if I'm with another SWAT guy and I see his helmet turn, one way or the other, I know he's covering that direction and I can cover the other way. And that is an implicit communication thing that happens between two people. So I want you to think about when you're driving down the road, how often you have seen another driver start to creep in their lane, not into your lane yet, but they've started to move over, and then the turn signal turns on. And then they come over, right? There was a cue, right? There's some indication that they were doing something, even though they hadn't explicitly turned their signal on or come into your lane yet. You saw them kind of do that, right? So a lot of this, like anticipating the moves of other drivers on the road, that's one of those things like you have to be paying attention to, because a lot of times you see an accident occur where like all of a sudden someone cuts you off or like blows through a red light and then boom, smash all the. What about the guy that's just like slowly moving into your lane, like encroaching, and you're like, whoa, buddy, like I'm right here, like those are the cushions sometimes that are more subtle that if you're not paying attention, you're going to miss because you might be in their blind spot or maybe they were in your blind spot, but now they're starting to creep in and you're not going to get as much lead time as if you were, paying more attention and happen to see it ahead of time.
One that gets me is normalcy bias. I'll sit there and watch the guy and I'm like, oh, he's going to do something stupid. And then I'm not thinking about, I need to get out of his way because he's going to do something stupid, right?
Well,
he's kind of being incredulous about it.
Yeah. And like consider maybe he catches it and then overcorrects, swerving back into his lane, losing traction, spinning out, and you're caught in the middle of that, right? Like,
Yep. Speaking of swerving and stuff, one of the big ways that you can manage a risk is think about the equipment of your car, right? And we joke about gear on the podcast, and do you need a truck gun? What kind of truck gun? What's the best truck gun to have? Should you have an AR-15 or should you have a Glock 19, or maybe both an AR-15 and a Glock 19, and maybe you need a 1911 because of 2 world wars? Well, here's a clue. Your car can't shoot guns. You shoot the guns, so they should probably be attached to you, not to your car. If you park your car and you leave a gun in your car, mostly what you're doing is you're equipping the meth head who's breaking into your car and stealing your gun. Especially if you've got stickers on the back of your car saying like, I got lots of guns. This car is insured by Smith & Wesson. Like, that's not buying you anything. That's adding your risk, not taking away your risk, right? So what gear should you have? Well, gosh, start with your tires. Seriously, look at your tires. Tires are like the thing worth investing in. If you have a choice between getting the cool LEDs underneath your car or like the cool rims or the cool like wing on the back of your car, your Honda Civic, that's awesome. But the thing that's actually going to change your car's performance is good quality tires, like the good ones. Spend a little extra money, because the higher rated tires are going to help you accelerate, turn, stop, and that's all a function of traction, their grip on the road, right? And we already talked about this a little bit, but I want to emphasize it. It's a big deal. You only get so much grip. It's a constant number in that equation, right? And you can use that to turn or to stop. If you try to do both at the same time, you're going to have a struggle. Okay? It's one or the other. So having the good tires will help you a little bit. It'll give you a little bit of grace in there, but it's not going to save you. Okay. You should probably have a basic roadside breakdown kit, right? Think about what should be in there. Something to divert traffic, cones, triangles, flares. You probably need a reflective vest because if you're going to get out of your car, you want the cars to notice you, and jumper cables, right? Because I don't want to get stuck somewhere. Consider, if your risk goes up, your roadside kit probably needs to get bigger and more elaborate and more carefully thought through. Okay. First aid kit. And there's like 2 different levels of first aid kits. There's like the Band-Aids kit, which you should have. And then there's the my arm is missing kit with the tourniquet and the quick clot and all that stuff, right? So 2 different levels of kit. A tow rope in order to get pulled out of trouble or to pull someone else out of trouble. A fire extinguisher, because cars catch fire.
True story.
But on that note, a loose fire extinguisher is a big, heavy, blunt metal object. And if you slam on the brakes, it's going to keep moving because P equals MV and F equals MA, physics, right? So you don't want to get a sudden physics lesson.
Some things on my list are a charged cell phone. Like make sure you never let your battery fall below a useful threshold. Like if you're stuck somewhere and your phone's dead, it doesn't help you much. Or at least like a power bank or something. What numbers to call, especially if you're somewhere foreign. Because it might not always be 911, right? It might be like I need a tow truck or roadside assistance or something like that. So numbers to call. This can be especially a big deal. I gave you one of my examples. If you don't speak the language, you might need some help. So consider those sorts of things. Directions or an address to where you're trying to go, especially if you're somewhere unfamiliar and you might get lost or stuck somewhere. Like be able to say, hey, I'm trying to reach this destination. Can you help me get there? And you might be able to get help that way. Pen and paper. Sounds dumb, but if they start giving you directions or you have to write down a phone number, having that with you, and then have some money on you. Like, I hate to be the guy that's super paranoid and like thinks about the the grid going down or anything weird like that, but like money talks. And if you got a little bit of cash on you that you can ask for some help with, it tends to send a message, right? People will help you out for money, or might get you out of trouble with someone on an interpersonal violence level too.
Yep. Another thing with the grid going down is navigation in general. Having paper maps, that sounds super old school, anachronistic, but consider if you're only using your cell phone to navigate, what happens when your cell phone dies for any of 1,000 reasons? It gets wet. You drop it in the toilet at the gas stop. It just explodes because it's got a lithium battery, and that's what lithium batteries sometimes choose to do. Who knows? Who cares, right? Do you have some backup to help you navigate? And especially when you're overseas, right? Especially if you're overseas, having some way to deal with the locals in their language. That might be like a pointy-talkie diagram or a translator, anything, right? To help you interact with the locals. So, the part you've all been waiting for, the tactical driving. Okay, Mike, we're going to talk about tactical stuff. It's going to be sweet. We're going to talk about how like J-turns and pitting and counter pitting, and it's going to be awesome. So that's all cool, and I hope you get some training in that, some hands-on training. It's tough to teach you how to do a J-turn on a podcast, so bear with me. I'm going to do what I can for you. This is, in my mind, the most important tactical stuff. This is stuff that I teach guys before they go overseas, like the serious how I want you to survive when the chips are down stuff, okay? First thing is don't drive alone. Don't drive alone. And I realize that that's not always an option, right? Most cops operate on their own in their own car. But if you have a choice, have a second person, okay? That second person has a job, right? It's not just running, picking the tunes on your phone.
DJ.
DJ. It's also to navigate. It's also to communicate, to take that burden off the driver, and to kind of keep watch and do the shooting if you need to shoot. Right? So I don't want people ever driving by themselves when we're overseas or in a high risk situation. If you can have a second whole car, do. You get mutual support from that. You're harder to trap, you're harder to flank, and you're harder to outnumber. I like all of those things. But given a choice, I'd rather have two guys in one car than one guy in two cars, right? Or two cars each, whatever. One car each. Consider that movement, generally speaking, is safety. It is tougher to hit a moving target than a stop target. It's science, okay? Stopping is generally dangerous. Stopping, especially unplanned stopping, should immediately get your attention. My risk just went through the roof if I stopped when I didn't intend to stop, okay? The longer I am stopped, the more time the adversary has to impact me, okay? I want you to be thoughtful about your route. Now, we have a tendency to just follow Google. I get that. I do it too. It might be faster to go a certain way. Whatever way Google wants you to do is probably the fastest way. But consider, is that way taking you through a rougher part of town? Or is it forcing you to stop in traffic somewhere where you don't want to stop? Okay. That is where stopping, looking at the route and figuring out where's Google taking me. And maybe there's a different path, right? Something that doesn't take me through choke points. Speaking of choke points, don't allow yourselves to be trapped really anywhere. We've talked about this a little bit in the ambush episode, especially at an intersection. When you can, I want you to stop in a way that gives you some maneuvering room. If you can't see the wheels of the car in front of you, you probably don't have enough room to exit without throwing in reverse and doing like the 15-point turn, right? And in the time it takes you to do the 15-point turn, you've already taken effective fire and it's gotten ugly, okay? Situational awareness you're not going to situational awareness yourself out of a crisis, right? But it's a thing I need you to think about. I need you to aggressively think about it. It's easy to say, it's hard to do. The thing I want to press on you is that situational awareness is an active process. You have to stay engaged mentally, physically, emotionally the whole time. Focus on the driving. Look around, make a point of noticing what is around you, where the other players are, where the other cars are, what they're doing. Are they giving cues that they are intending to do you harm, right?
It's not it's the accountability part, right? That in terms of like situational awareness, it's not just a thing that you have or a thing that you don't.
Yes.
Right? That term by itself is not a verb. You know, what Jim is talking about is the action term, right? The verb part is looking around, taking tabs, like having a tally of people, of where people are, like, and actively paying attention. That's big difference.
Yes. Situational awareness is a thing you fight for. And you have to actively, aggressively fight for it, right? You need to scan and identify and mentally map the situation around you. I want you to be willing to accept some body damage to get out of an ambush. And that's tough. That requires the acknowledgement things are sideways, and I'm willing to bang up some metal to get out of this, right? But remember, the airbag doesn't know you're playing bumper cars on purpose. The airbag might go off on its own. And airbags are intense if you've ever experienced one. We asked our audience on Facebook, what do they want to know as far as driving goes? And somebody mentioned surveillance detection routes. That gets pretty serious pretty fast. But the things I can talk about as far as surveillance detection goes is surveillance detection is a situational awareness drill. It is an exercise in situational awareness. It is entirely a game of mentally recording who is behind you and trying to do that in a non-alerting way. It's tempting to drive like an idiot or outrun them if you think they're following you, or take notes on someone, or take pictures of them. But those are all awful tactics. The best counter tactic, if you think someone's following you, if you think someone's surveilling you, is to bore them. Get them to think about something other than you, right? If you're in the United States and you're on the up and up and you have every reason to think that people shouldn't be following you, if you're being followed, like actually being followed by some dirtbag, that's more Mike's realm. Mike, what should you do if you think you're being followed?
Get on the phone with somebody, communicate, right? Get the out. Don't stop. Stick to routes you're familiar with, so you don't box yourself in anywhere. Consecutive right turns are usually safe. Keep making right turns.
Should I drive to a police station?
Maybe. If you're on the phone with 911, they're telling you to, because there's cops there, then sure. But like, you might drive to a substation at some odd hour of the night, and what are you going to do? Go to the front door? No one's going to answer. So not necessarily. You can maybe like orbit this police station so that they start to get smart while you get resources closer to you. But I don't know that just like pulling into the parking lot is necessarily going to be helpful. I mean, it might be a deterrent, but there's no guarantee, right?
Yeah, so I want to be clear that I'm talking about two very separate concepts here, right? I'm talking about surveillance as in you're overseas and you think the Russians are following you versus you're in Las Vegas and there was a road rage kind of thing, and the guy just won't leave you alone and is continuing to follow you, right?
Yeah.
Two different scenarios. In surveillance detection, use your mirrors, note license plates, and look for repetition across space and time. That's how you catch people surveilling you, okay? Counter ambush. Now, we did a whole episode about counter ambush, and I want you to go back and listen to it if you can, but the Cliff's Notes, you have 3 options if you find yourself in the middle of an ambush. Get off the X, get out of the kill zone, right? Fight back with overwhelming force, or get help from outside. So your planning and your preparation should be focused on making those options viable. What can I do to this car to enable it to get off an X, even if it's got damage or it's blocked in?
Yeah, the counter ambush things I would throw out there is consider whether you're in a near ambush or a far ambush. If it is something with some distance that you can break contact and get away, then do that. If it's something that is so close it's in your face, you're going to have to fight your way through it. But make sure you're categorizing, is this near or far, right? Do I have to fight through this, or can I just get away?
Yeah. So in the fight back category, what can I do to make sure I can fight back with overwhelming force from this car? Think through, how are you going to shoot from the car?
Yeah, it might be get out. Bail.
Do I need to dismount and go assault? I'm an Air Force guy. I'd rather not. I'm going to tuck tail and run. That's what I do. I don't have heavy weapons. I can't bust out the saw because I'm not rolling around with a saw, right? And get help from outside. And that means communication, right? I need a PACE plan, primary, alternate, contingency, emergency, ways of communicating. I'm in trouble. Come save me, right? You need to plan for a disabled car. What are you going to do if a car gets a flat tire, or the engine just catches fire, or you get your tire shredded, or you get hit by another car? Okay. Are you going to jump into car 2 and leave that disabled car behind? Maybe. Do you have a tow rope that you can pull that car out of trouble with? Are you going to stay and fix it? Are you going to wait for the Taliban AAA to come out and save you? Think through, what am I going to do if my car breaks down? I want you to do a walk around on your car every day. Stop, deliberately walk around and deliberately look at all the places someone could attach something under your car, over your car, side of your car, whatever. Okay. You're probably not going to find anything. That's okay. What you're doing is you're setting a baseline so that you recognize the zebra when the zebra shows up, right? If your vehicle is armored, I want you to note that vehicle armor, car armor, is usually meant to keep you alive long enough to get out of the X. It is not designed to keep you alive just sitting there on the X. Eventually something's going to get through, right? So you need to understand the limitations of your armor.
It's bullet resistant, not proof. And after a few hits, it's going to get ugly. And particularly if we're talking glass, you run into other problems, which is, are you going to be able to see out of it?
Yep. Another thing is, if you slam your thumb in it, it will take your thumb off. Those doors are heavy. True. That's the thing you should know. So this is a thing, every counterterrorism briefing I've ever received says, you need to vary your routes and times. Well, that's one of those things that sounds easy, but in real life is really freaking hard to do.
Practice, pain in the ass.
Yeah, because there's only so many ways to get across town. There's only so many schedules that you're going to be on. There's a workday schedule. There's a flying schedule, right? That you don't have a whole lot of say in. But stop and think about, especially if you're doing the same thing every day for days. The bad guys can develop your pattern of life. And once they have your pattern of life, they don't have to channel you. You've already channeled yourself. You've set yourself up for the ambush that way. And I talked about route study earlier. Doing that will simplify your navigation. It will give you outs so you know which way to turn if you get yourself in trouble. And it's also a chance to look for choke points, things like tunnels, bridges, overpasses, areas where you might get yourself in trouble. And it will also help you catch where the crappy parts of town are. So it's my tactical driving stuff, and And it's often not the cool maneuvers and high-speed chases and stuff. It's often not making your tires screech. It's that stuff. It's don't be alone. Don't be an easy victim. Look like you're not someone who needs to be screwed with. Okay.
Hide in plain sight, you know?
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to play the gray man card, but like...
But be boring.
Keep a low profile.
And don't look like a desirable victim. Okay. So to kind of wrap up, just big picture, 2 things that are going to save your life behind the wheel are keeping your eyes and attention up and your speed down. If you're a military or law enforcement leader and you're thinking of like, what would be good training? Pay for a driving course. Like if you think about what gets soldiers hurt, it's flipping the Humvee, right? Like
or the side by side or whatever.
Yeah, the Hemet or whatever. There's good data to support what I'm saying on that, right?
Yeah.
So pay for the driving training. I think it's worthwhile.
Yeah, good summary. I got nothing. Be less distracted. Don't drink and drive. And slow down a little bit. That's all I got. Wear your seatbelt.
All right, be safe out there. Be smart out there. Drive safe out there, America.
Ricky Bobby, if you're not first, you're last.
Rubbing is racing.
All right, guys, that's all we got for tonight. This episode is brought to you by Ride-On Optics. Ride-On is bringing you high-quality glass at a great value. I use and trust their scopes, binoculars, and red dot sights, and you can too with their unconditional lifetime warranty. If you ever have a problem with their gear, they will replace it, not repair it. Finish up your next build and keep a little extra cash on hand for ammo so you can actually go out and shoot that thing. Find your next optic at rideonoptics.com.
This episode is also brought to you by ManusX. We've talked a lot about the tactical fantasy on this podcast, and one of the quickest ways to break your tactical fantasies and actually improve your performance is by getting real feedback. One of the ways you can do that is with ManusX. You're not going to get better at shooting on your own. You need practice, data, and coaching, and you need to make the most of your ammo with good live and dry fire training. Manus is a family of training devices that tracks you while you train. It times and tracks everything you do in a drill and coaches you as you go. It is indispensable to taking your shooting to the next level. Go find them on manusx.com.
Don't forget that we put out new episodes on the 1st and the 15th of every month. If you like what we're doing, you can have our Patreon. Give us $1 for each new episode. That money's going to go back into bringing you good content. If you want to interact with us, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We are at TacTangents. You can also email info@tacticaltangents.com. And one last thing, our Facebook discussion group. We've got a little group going on Facebook. If you go to the groups tab on our page, you can join it. We've got more followers on our page than we have in the group. So I know there's some of you out there following the Facebook page that are on Facebook that are not in the group. Lots of like-minded people in there. So come hang out with us. All right. That's all we got. Good talk.